Overwatch is largely a team game, and yet, a lot of the time in the league, some players get a lot more love than others. It's natural and honestly understandable, but sometimes it does lead to people forgetting about certain players who deserve a lot more of the credit, because other guys are simply hogging the spotlight. We all have that player or two that we are going to stand by with and die on a hill for, and say that they are completely underappreciated. But what if we take it a step further? Today we compile a list of guys from Season 5 who didn't get nearly enough love from the public while playing for their respective teams. This isn't so much the most underrated players in general, it's more of a one player per team type of deal. If you want to see like a top 5 most underrated players or top 10 of the entire season, let me know in the comments below. But until then, here is my most underrated player from every team in Season 5. Starting with the Atlanta Reign, I'm going with Venom. Venom's role on Atlanta was pretty specific. He'd come in for Tracer metas, and that was it. He had one job, for sure, but he did it pretty well. It's to the point where people forget about his impact. Kai, Hawk, and the flex supports get a lot of the love, while Venom put in a ton of the dirty work during his time when Atlanta were at their best. In the Kickoff Clash and Mid-Season Madness tournament runs, Venom was a very important member on the damage line, often coming in to dominate control maps, or in the case of the Mid-Season Tournament, be the primary starter. And throughout all of those big matches, Venom held his own against a lot of premier Tracer players and general DPS talents. His movement and timely abilities to get clutch kills kinda flew under the radar, and I want to give him the credit he deserves. The Boston Uprising are up next. Boston had some pretty good pieces that helped them make a strong late season push. People like Crimzo and Punk definitely stand out, but they simply cannot be a two-man show. Another guy who deserves a bit more love is their mid-season acquisition, Seeker. To be brutally honest, the Boston DPS line was mediocre all season, and then he came in as the new guy in unfamiliar territory and gave it some life as a clear-cut upgrade. And you have to remember that this guy joined in early August with no previous synergy whatsoever. But even through all of that, he became a late-season leader that pushed this team into the play-ins with some respectable Sojourn play. Seeker really helped give this team a jolt of life. He wasn't a god-tier, like, top-level player, but definitely their most consistent and respectable DPS. Just having that third option really did a lot for this group, and it's hard to say for certain if they play as well as they do down the stretch without him. Chengdu Hunters, Monk. The big takeaway from a season ruined by financial issues for the Chengdu Hunters was how much Leave and Jinmu put the team on their backs. They were constantly keeping their team in big games, and were the primary reason they had a shot at the playoffs to begin with by the time October hit. But for whatever reason, some people forget that Monk had a lot of timely plays in some pretty close matchups. It wasn't all the time or anything, but there were plenty of moments where Monk would come out and play out of his mind, especially when it came to Ana. Clutch sleeps, timely kills, big bionades, they were the norm for this guy in some tense 5-mappers with some rival teams. When the Hunter's DPS couldn't do enough, he was usually the prime suspect to step up. It wasn't always in a winning effort, but you could feel it. He's oftentimes not talked about for the simple fact that Chengdu were mediocre all season, and he's just not a superstar player. But that ain't right. As I see it, Monk put in a lot of work, and he should be getting some credit. When it comes to the Dallas Fuel, you have to dig a little deep. Since they won the championship and all, their entire starting lineup is going to get a lot of praise naturally. They all get respect. But there is one guy who always does what he's asked to, but sometimes fades into irrelevance just because he wasn't a full-time starter. We're going with Doha. This guy is always reliable, and he always was in 2022. They could throw him into the starting lineup at a moment's notice after being on the bench for weeks, and he would not miss a single beat. At the beginning, they called this name primarily to play Soldier 76, and he did it pretty well. In the Summer Showdown, he literally was playing Genji over Sparkle at the beginning, and that's a big-time statement right there. And then there was the brief time where he played Sombra as well, and throughout all those instances that I just named, he never played poorly. He's more so of a specialist, but Doha was solid whenever his number was called. He helped this team win some games at numerous points throughout the season, and he deserves some credit. He kind of faded into the background because Edison and Sparkle are so flashy, and they were the ones starting in the grand finals, but Doha needs to get some credit too, for sure. Florida Mayhem, RuPaul. I always feel like we look at the heroics of someone, the DPS, and even the fun playstyle of Sir Majed when thinking about Florida. But one guy that sometimes slips out of the conversation in terms of contributions is RuPaul. Much like Seeker on Boston, this man came in as a mid-season acquisition. Nobody knew what he was about, but it never fazed him, and he played fearlessly. He went out there, and he established himself as a reliable, above-average starter in this league. He was very good, across multiple stages mind you, while showing prowess as a top-level Baptiste. His more stable playstyle even made him a more viable option than Majed. He actually benched this man for a good bit of the season, and then by the time we hit the offseason, he completely stole his job away. And this is a guy Florida got mid-season, for crying out loud. I can understand that people like and respect RuPaul to begin with, I get it. We respect his Baptiste and what he did in a short amount of time, but with this kind of resume and how he played, he should be getting even more praise. Guangzhou Charge, Farway, 1987. If we're talking underrated players in general, this is so obviously Choi Se-won. But since this is the Charge in specific, you gotta dig a bit deeper, since he was their best performer easily. I am of the belief that the most underrated player from the Guangzhou Charge last year was Farway. He honestly was not anything special, for sure, but he definitely was respectable. Just average or not, just thinking about his contributions and doing the dirty work and being consistent, Farway kinda doesn't get talked about. He may not have been lighting up the league like Shu or Fielder, but he did a good job of enabling the teammates around him and staying out of trouble with some pretty solid positioning. Through the Charge's tough start to the year and beyond, Farway's numbers were pretty solid. Respectable death rate, okay damage numbers, and good healing across the board. He may not be the flashiest player in the world, but he wasn't doing much to make his team worse either. His level of effort can often go unnoticed because of this, but that's the truth of the matter. Farway is a lot better than we give him credit for. Nothing out of this world, but somewhat reliable for sure. Hangzhou Spark, Gushwei. This could be a little bizarre to some of you. Gushwei got a ton of hype during the playoffs, and I myself didn't really think of him as anything much during the regular season, oftentimes criticizing his play. But when looking back at it, he really wasn't bad. It's just that in the playoffs, I'd say he was even more noticeable. During the regular season, though, he did his absolute best. The meta wasn't always the greatest for him, but whenever it was Winston-centric, he was pretty reliable. Gushwei showed that he still has it on this hero, even after all these years. The Primal Blades were still pretty nutty, and the decision-making was definitely still there. As much slack as I gave the man, his numbers were pretty spectacular. In a lot of cases, they were comparable, if not better, than Smurf and Fearless, which is a major statement. So, it's with great pleasure that I say I apologize to Gushwei. The man can definitely still play, and he flies under the radar thanks to that amazing DPS line. Houston Outlaws, Lastro. Depending on who you're talking to, you'll either hear that Lastro doesn't get enough credit, or he is way worse than you think. I am of the belief that he is more so underrated. He wasn't taking the world by storm for his main support play, but considering he's never played the role before, he did a good job. To pick up Lucio and be okay on him, then play Brigitte at a relatively high level is something you should not be ignoring, but some people do. He did whatever this team asked of him, oftentimes swapping between roles. Lastro's flexibility and in-game leadership were extremely important. He quietly elevated Houston's level of play while getting very little credit. It's always DPS this, Dante that. But Lastro did a ton of heavy lifting while staying in his own lane and never complaining the entire time. Just a true warrior who did whatever it took to win. Mad respect. London Spitfire, Landon. Oh yeah, we gotta give this Spitfire backline some love. With how much focus Hottie, Sparker, and Backbone got, it's a natural conclusion to come to. The upgraded backline, though, proved to be very important in helping the Spitfire go from one win, just a year prior, to playoff contenders. Landon in particular stayed pretty steady throughout this year, allowing for Hottie to be more aggressive and do his thing at a role star level. But what people forget is that the reason he could be a Chad is because he had a Chad support player. I love the way that Landon played BAP in the rush comps, and you have to appreciate him low-key being one of the best Kiriko players in the entire playoffs. Landon subtly definitely stands out as one of the most reliable flex supports in the league in 2022. He played well in most compositions that London played consistently, and he can be found in the top percentile statistically on most flex heroes in the game. He reminds me a lot of Crimzo from a couple of years ago on Houston. Landon balled out, but doesn't always get the credit thanks to the other personalities on his team. But the fact of the matter is that those guys don't show off the way they do without Landon's incredible play. LA Gladiators, Space. Okay, I understand. He didn't play much. Of course he's going to be underrated. But for me, it goes a bit beyond that. Cause whenever Space did play, he showed that he still has it. He was by no means washed just because the team preferred Reiner. Anytime Space got the opportunity to play, he made the absolute most of it. That drive to compete and to win was absolutely still present. At the start, he was basically just a Sigma specialist on Circuit Royale. He was good at it, but that's all he was playing. But then came the Summer Showdown, where LA were struggling big time, and Reiner showed signs of weakness on the Junker Queen. So the team calls up Space for the final few games of the qualifier, and there was a notable difference. Space very much held the zone, even though he exclusively was riding the bench beforehand. It is amazing. When looking at the stats, he led the league in damage on her, as well as Sigma. And for a guy that was supposed to be on his last legs on his way out, that's pretty nutty. The sample size is little, of course, but still, from what we saw, Space was damn good. Because he wasn't around much, people are quick to forget about him. With a team like the Valiant, there's plenty of leeway, as they weren't a very popular team, and they weren't that great either. So many guys made contributions that we just don't take into account because of it. As for me, I'm going with Easy Han. I don't know. When people bring up that 2022 Valiant DPS line, the names that are brought up are usually Dia for obvious reasons, and Becky. But man, Easy Han was no joke. Dude slowly but surely got more involved as the season went on, and he never looked back. There were inconsistencies, sure, but man, his Sojourn and Sombra play were not a joke. A lot of the time, they felt above average from a league standard. The numbers won't blow you away just because he played on a bad team, but man, when you watched him play with your eyes, he always found ways to stand out and make huge plays. Lots of timely picks and hounding enemy DPS. He got the best of some well-respected damage dealers in this league on more than one occasion. He's honestly one of the biggest reasons the Valiant had their late season surge. The man popped off big time, but is easily forgotten because there are just bigger names on an unpopular team that are beloved within this community. alexyOWL, Gangnam Jin. Now, I know what you're gonna say, but ATP, he struggled on main support. He was bad. How could he possibly be underrated? I get it. I really do. He was forced into a role that he was uncomfortable with, and he could not keep up. However, when the NYXL gave him any sort of opportunity to play his natural role, he still had it. The moment that he got to play something not named Lucio and Brig, his impact increased big time. He clearly was one of the bloodthirstiest Zens in the league on numerous occasions, and it was like a switch flipped off whenever he got this kind of chance. The moment he got his freedom to play flex support, he unleashed his true power onto the rest of the world. It didn't matter much in the end, of course, but one can't help but wonder what this team would have looked like towards the end of the season if they always had him on main support instead. If it weren't for him, there'd be even less life with this team for sure. What a shame that things had to go this way, because he definitely was still a good player, but now his career could be coming to an end. Paris/Vegas Eternal, Malthul. With a train wreck roster that literally became brand new mid-season, it's not exactly easy to pick a name out here. The sample size is very small, and you don't have any standouts, let alone under-the-radar talent. So I'm gonna go with the closest thing in mind for me, that being Malthul. This flex DPS player was a rotational piece who managed to have a couple of bright spots and montage-worthy clips on Genji and Pharah. He showed off some great mechanics in a losing effort, but doesn't get any love for it because his team struggled a lot. He felt like a background guy, despite making some great plays from time to time. You could argue that just about any Eternal player was underrated, I guess, but I'm going to be picking Malthul for this reason. Philadelphia Fusion / Soul Infernal, Belos Rhea. Bellisria's time on Philly might not have ended on the greatest of notes, but I'd argue that he was one of the most important contributions to their overall success. His decision-making and fast tempo allowed for him to thrive in numerous dive compositions. He especially made his presence known on Winston in what I consider to be at least one of the league's best wrecking balls. He came in as a rookie and he played the leader role pretty well. He led the charge and made space for those star DPS players on his team. For a rookie with only moderate expectations, I'd say that he held his own compared to some of these league veterans. But thanks to the star power of MN3 and Zest, sometimes he simply fades into irrelevance when he actually did make some good contributions. Then there's the shock. With the attention that Proper received, you could literally call any player on this team underrated. As for me, my pick's gonna be Sam. On somewhat limited playtime, he proved to be a good complementary piece to Proper, who consistently held his own. He did a ton of flexing throughout the year, highlighted by a solid Genji, Echo, and Hanzo. Sam probably deserved more playtime. It's just hard when Proper's on your team, and the meta doesn't always suit you. Sam gave this team a great boost, especially during the early season, but the media completely discredits him, as well as the other Shock DPS, because Proper's a thing. I love Proper to death, and he deserves credit, but it's really unfair to the rest of the team, because Sam and the others made some great contributions too. Seoul Dynasty, Fitz. I cannot believe I'm saying this right now. I really can't. People have forgotten about Fitz. He has been a great player since his rookie year and has stayed consistent ever since, but for whatever reason this year, there's been less love than usual. If anything, there's been criticism that he just isn't what he used to be, and that's not very fair, as he had a few not-so-great matches in the playoffs, and he wasn't borderline MVP level like 1 year prior, but why does that matter when he was still good? He still performed at a higher level than a majority of hitscan players in this league, and people are trying to act like he does not matter. He did his job very well, with some excellent individual matches that were obviously ignored at times. He did absolutely everything he could on a team very much focused on other players, and he deserves to get more recognition. Fitz is still a beast, and I will not hear otherwise. Shanghai Dragons, Lee Jae-gon. Another one that feels very weird to say, but the more I think about it, the more I realize that this isn't very far-fetched. Lee Jae-gon served as one half of Shanghai's elite backline for 3 years, as we all know. And yet, when push came to shove this year, Izayaki was the one getting role star recognition, even though you can argue that he did not deserve it. And yet here's Lee Jae-gon, who basically wasn't even in the conversation, yet he was still as stable as ever thanks to all of the Lucio that we saw. He pretty much never had any bad games for the most part, and when the Dragons struggled, it was so painfully obvious that Shanghai either had other individuals at fault, or they just couldn't immediately figure out new metas. And let's not forget that whenever this team even tried to sub him out for Bebe, they would lose most of the time. Lee Jae-gon was clearly the glue that held this team together last year, and in my opinion, he had a better year than Izayaki did. But because he wasn't getting all those crazy Reddit Lucio environmental kills like we've seen in years past, people chose to ignore him and not think of him as very important. It could just be me, but that's the vibe I get. Toronto Defiant, Hoppa. There are 3 constants when looking at the history of this league. The Shock being relevant, the Fusion coming in second, and Hoppa having a starting role somewhere. My man found himself on his 4th team in 5 years and still showed that he has what it takes. Hoppa came in as the veteran presence of this team, with question marks on how much he'd even play, but he practically ran away with it. The competition with Muse did not last very long. I'm not saying that Hoppa was like this top-tier player at tank, but he definitely hung in there and made some plays of his own. It's way too easy to hype up Hisu and the backline when looking at what Toronto did, but man, Hoppa did a ton in his own right. He got a lot of starting time this year, and even picked up some new heroes along the way. And the fact that he played Winston over Muse in the playoffs goes to show just how valuable he was to the rest of his team. This might have been Hoppa's best year, or second best depending on who you're talking to. But people just aren't bringing it up. Give this man more love right now. Switching gears to Vancouver, your other Canadian team, I'm going with their mid-season flex DPS acquisition, King. I think the reasoning behind this one is pretty simple. Aspire was nasty. It's just hard to give anybody else credit when he was the obvious hard carry and one of the most exciting players on a mediocre team that we've ever seen. Naturally, a guy like King is going to become a background character. It's understandable, but not entirely fair. King made good contributions too. It's no coincidence that Vancouver started winning more games after he joined. He was the exact piece that they needed to have more well-rounded pieces for playmaking. His Genji was absolutely clean, and his Sombra wasn't half bad either. He only had like 3 months to make a name for himself, and he certainly put himself on the map. But thanks to the overwhelming love for his DPS counterpart, sometimes King gets lost in the mix. And finally, the Washington Justice. I'd say that it's pretty fair to go with either Krillin or Kalios. They each stepped into a big role that they weren't really supposed to be in, and did pretty alright. But I'ma go with Krillin, personally. What I liked about Krillin this year was how he did some pretty valuable flexing for his team, not once, but twice. First was being the starter while waiting for Vigilante to turn 18. The second came when the Justice became a 5-man show after their budget issues. And through it all, this man showed resilience and professionalism. He did absolutely everything he could despite not being the greatest player out there. It came in a losing effort a lot of the time, but Krillin made some nice plays to push teams like the Fuel and Shock to their limits in tournament settings. When somebody aside from Decay had to step up, it was actually Krillin a lot of the time, surprisingly. It's just a little thing considering it usually did not help the Justice win, but Krillin sometimes did play better than he's given credit for. He wasn't a star, that is for sure, but definitely did provide some bang for Washington's buck as a guy that wasn't really supposed to be much of anything. He was honestly one of the more exciting Washington players in 2022. Krillin was like average at best, but it's just those special moments that makes me want to give him some credit. The man played his heart out for sure. But maybe you disagree with this take, or some of the others as we reach the end of this video, and I welcome you to leave your own thoughts and a list of your own down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this content and you want more just like it, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you're new. I would really appreciate it a lot. And until the next one, guys, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.